Welcome to the 2023 DiLCo Lecture Series on Digital Language and Communication. I'm Yanis Androutopoulos from the University of Hamburg. DiLCo is a 3-year scientific network on digital language variation in context initiated in 2021. It's coordinated at Hamburg University by my colleague Heike Zinsmeister and myself, and includes scholars from universities in the US, UK, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Denmark. DiLCo is generously supported by the University of Hamburg within the Universities of Excellence scheme, which is funded by the German federal government and the federal states. The DiLCo network aims to stimulate scientific exchange between various approaches to digital language and communication research within linguistics, and to bridge gaps between qualitative and quantitative research methods. We organize online and on-site activities such as conference panels, methods workshops, and this lecture series. Our lectures showcase cutting-edge international research by senior and younger scholars who draw on key concepts in sociocultural linguistics to shed light on language variation and change, as well as language ideologies in digital communication. These lectures are recorded and made available in an open access repository currently located on Hamburg University's video portal Lecture2Go and accessible through the DiLCo website. Each lecture is about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by discussion, and do feel free to post any questions and comments into the chat during the lecture, and we'll take them up in the discussion time. I'm now delighted to introduce today's speakers, Michele Zappavigna from Sydney, Australia, where it's 7 p.m., I think, right now. Michele received her PhD at the University of Sydney and worked there as a postdoctoral fellow before joining the University of New South Wales, where she's an associate professor in the School of Arts and Media. Michele's research on the language and discourse of social media is globally very well known, and her combination of systemic functional linguistics, social semiotics, multimodal analysis, and corpus-based methods has been highly influential in the past decade. She has written or co-authored 10 books, including the seminal Discourse on Twitter and Social Media, How We Use Language to Create Affiliation on the Web from 2012, one of the most widely cited monographs on social media from a linguistics viewpoint. Other works include the textbook Researching the Language of Social Media, co-authored 2014 with second edition in 2022, the monograph Searchable Talk, Hashtags and Social Media Meta-Discourse in 2018, and a number of papers, notably on her concept of ambient affiliation, on practices of subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and identity construction, genre, multimodality, and other topics. Her forthcoming book is on emoji and social media paralanguages, and it might be the case that we now get a sneak preview into the arguments and the main topics of this book with Michele's talk today on emoji as paralanguage. Welcome, Michele Zappavigna. We're very happy to have you with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I'll share my screen. Here we are. So I'm going to be talking about emoji as paralanguage, and my talk will have two parts. I'll start off by explaining the model that I have developed with a colleague, looking at emoji text relations, so how emoji work together with their co-text. And then I'll be using that to explore how emoji function as an affiliation resource in social media discourse as people are negotiating social bonds, both convivial and adversarial. So why am I talking about emoji as paralanguage? So why paralanguage at all? I would argue that emoji are heavily dependent on their co-text, and this is why I think they're paralinguistic. That dependent on the co-text is a clear verbal anchorage, so they're dependent on what's happening around them in the language, and they're rarely completely unambiguous. So there's part of what makes them have this kind of semiotic potential that they do have is their essential underspecification of meaning, making them highly flexible. So instead, they're variable and determined by the context and the co-text. and at times they require degrees of familiarity with cultural conventions and knowledge, so from Eastern and Western languages and gestural languages, sign languages, and even fictional communication systems. Can't do the Spock Vulcan salute. We should do a poll about how many of you can. What's happening? Okay, so how can we model paralanguage? Well, there are many ways to do it, but the way that I've been looking at it is drawing on some work that I've previously been involved with, which is attempting to develop a social semiotic model of embodied paralanguage. So looking at how gesture works alongside with spoken language, developed with colleagues around Sydney. In saying that, I'm not arguing that emoji are, I don't take the step that some researchers take of analogizing between emoji and gesture, since I see both as having different sets of affordances. Emoji as picture characters, as we'll see, have their own particular affordances. But I would argue that both gesture and emoji are part of paralanguage. So yes, I will be giving you a little bit of a look at what Lorenzo Loggi and I have been doing in our book on emoji and social media paralanguages, which has just gone into production. So it should hopefully be out next year. It's funny, isn't it, when you've got a screen, you've got all kinds of things. And now I have part of Zoom covering the bit that I want to read. But anyway, up the top here, you can see some of the corpora that I've been working with that feed into the modeling process that we went through to develop the theoretical perspective that we're using to look at emoji text relations. So one corpus was focused on collecting emoji from people and asking them about how they use their emoji, so that involved interviews. Another was focused more on using a single emoji, in this case, the hot beverage emoji, because I really like drinking coffee, and looking at what's happening in the environment of that emoji, its connection with other emoji as we explore its connection with the context. And then another corpus focused on a single field of experience, so discourse about working from home and looking at how emoji function there. So these fed into the model that we were developing on emoji text relations. So that's the focus of the book that I just mentioned. And in turn, fed into my ongoing work on ambient affiliation, which I'm going to be talking about in the second half of this talk. I'm going to be focusing on one aspect of ambient affiliation, which is dialogic affiliation, so where actual interaction is happening between people. And I'm going to be looking at a particular context, which is that of hotel quarantine food reviews. So people who are stuck in hotel quarantine and receive food to their hotel room, and then they make TikTok videos about it, reviewing the food, talking about their experiences. And I'm going to be looking at some of the interactions in the comment feed for those kinds of videos. But also in the book, we also explore communing affiliation, where people are not necessarily directly and interacting with one another, but yet still part of this kind of mass coordination of feeling. And there we look at a kind of political corpus with people basically complaining about Australian politicians and their failure to deal adequately with one of the waves of the coronavirus pandemic. Okay, so when looking at emoji, I'm going to be drawing on a metaphor, that of the Roman god Janus looking both ways. So this idea of having in one's mind as an analyst always trying to hold two dimensions in consciousness at once. So looking two ways when considering emoji as a semiotic resource. So, but what are those two ways? Looking at emoji as text, so looking at how emoji relate to their cotext. That may be other Unicodes, so other written text, or could be relations with images, hashtags, and other phenomena that are part of social media posts. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, looking at emoji as talk. considering their role in the play of bonds and in exchange, in how people negotiate meanings as they interact. So these are two things that are always happening at once. So for instance, in terms of relations with the codetext, we might have an emoji like the smiling face emoji here. My lights have just turned off. I have no idea why. Hey, Google, turn on the light. Sorry about that. So we might have an emoji like the smiling face emoji harmonizing with the codetext, so washing interpersonal meaning backwards over the text, at the same time as being involved in the communing and negotiation in potentially monologue, dialogue, or multi-log. Okay, so having these two ways of looking in mind at once. And if we are doing that, we'll realize that an emoji like this can both function to co-construe attitude along with the language at the same time as enacting solidarity in terms of the interaction. So this is part of the reason that we can't just read that emoji via its CLDR name. We can't just think of it as enacting a meaning of smiling. It's doing more than that. So why not just dive in? Why do we need to bother with this? Why don't we just dive into doing an affiliation analysis and look at the play of bonds? Well, I would argue that if you don't look at the complexities of the emoji text relations, if you don't analyze that first, you're at risk of doing a common sense analysis of what's actually happening in terms of the affiliation. And also, we need to lay a solid foundation for exploring what can be really complex, and that is the intermodal relations that characterize digital discourse. So if we don't set up the emoji text relations carefully and think about them, then it's really difficult to look at, how are emoji relating to GIFs, to images, to all other kinds of things? How is the whole multimodal orchestration happening? But what are we actually looking at when we're looking at emoji? So emoji are code points as defined by the Unicode Consortium. So here we can see an emoji stored in memory as, this is the hot beverage emoji, the hexadecimal code point U+2615, which is then displayed on screen depending on the particularities of the vendor and how it renders the emoji with a font. It can end up looking like this Tweemoji that we see here, or it could look like all of these ones on the right-hand side. And the vendor might be Apple, Google, whoever, and they decide what it looks like. So Unicode doesn't have anything to do with the standardization of the visual representation of emoji as glyphs. And the visual appearance is determined via the rendering process and the vendor's choices in this respect. Okay, and we're going to be dealing with Tweemoji in this talk with this kind of visual representation, which is the Twitter style. This can present problems for corpus processing. Okay, so it actually is quite important to get the technical side right. So for instance, when you construct a corpus containing a whole heap of emoji, just say you scrape stuff from Twitter or any data source, and you have it in some kind of text file, are you counting what you think you're counting? So if you're using, for instance, concordance software to help you count what's happening in your corpus, these generally don't natively understand emoji sequences. So for instance, here we have the man singer emoji, which is involves this emoji sequence that you can see underneath. Basically the man, a zero width joinder, which is like the glue sticking the man together with the microphone to make the man singer. So that's fine, but what happens when that is imported into concordance software that doesn't understand this kind of sequencing? So here's some examples of my frequency lists. And what might you be worried about? We might get worried about things like these red heart emoji, and you want to make sure that they are the actual, that actual emoji code and not part of the base emoji forming more complex emoji. So in examples like these ones here. So you need to make sure you're not accidentally counting base emoji which form more complex emoji in these zero-width joined sequences and in emoji modifiers, etc. Okay. So these technical details are important to understand as they impact how we process and count emoji in files for kind of corpus-based and more quantitative projects, but also how we consider issues relating to semiotic mode and to visual representation in both qualitative and in multimodal studies, where these are kind of key things. And also how we think about emoji as a resource that is used within semiotic technologies, that is, within technologies for making meaning, like social media platforms, for instance. Okay, so let's look at how I'm thinking about emoji text relations and the specificities of that. So just going to move this. There we go. So let's look at the modeling principles that I'm applying. So emoji don't have any or extremely limited syntagmatic resources like word org or conjugation that you have in language to explicitly link them to other semiotic resources. So how do we know which emoji, if we've got in our data set, interact with which parts or stretches of language? How do we know that there's a coordination of meaning happening if we don't have these other additional clues that we have with language? Well, one of the principles that we could use is that of proximity. So is the emoji close to the cotext in terms of the logogenetic unfolding, that is the unfolding of the text? That seems to be a useful clue. We also have a principle drawn from Sumin Zhao's work on digital learning resources of minimum mapping. So can the emoji and the cotext be constrained to a shared region of meaning potential that makes sense? Okay, they bounded in some way. And then thirdly, prosodic correspondence. So do the emoji and the cotext travel together prosodically? So for instance, the classic example here would be where we have an oscillating evaluative prosody. So we have a back and forth between negative and positive evaluation. Do the emoji travel with the language in that way? So these were the key principles that we were applying. And to use another metaphor, you could think of a convex lens. So on the one hand, you have the written mode, and then you have the picture character mode or emoji coming together in an instance of textual meaning. So we have this potential on both sides. We can look at this potential through Halliday's linguistic metafunctions, through an ideational function of representing experience, an interpersonal function of enacting relationships, and a textual function of organizing discourse. So both emoji and a language can work together along those three ways of looking at meaning. And when they do that, they converge in the instance to they can converge through ideational concurrence, interpersonal resonance, and textual synchronicity. And this is where I'm drawing on some of the ideas that came out of the project on embodied semiosis and paralanguage. Okay, so just to take some toy examples to illustrate this, thinking along through an ideational lens, looking at how emoji and language co-construe experience. So a text like this: I bought a new laptop from working from home. Here we can see the emoji and the language construing a thing entity together. Looking through an interpersonal lens, so enacting social relations. I love working from home. The emoji working together with the positive affect in the language. And thinking textually in terms of organizing discourse. So working from home is my favorite way to work. Here, the language and the emoji are co-creating the theme in the textual unfolding. Okay, so this is the full system network that we developed for looking at emoji text relations. So the entry criteria for this network is there is an emoji text relation, that's the unit. And we have this idea of convergence of meaning coming together across emoji and the text. So along dimensions of concurrence, resonance, and synchronicity. So this network, if you're not familiar with it, with system networks, simply represents choices in meaning. So the curly brackets is an and relation, and the square brackets is an or relation where you have to choose between two options. So I'm not going to, don't worry, I'm not going to go through every step in this network in this talk in sequence. I'm just going to focus on the first level just to give you a taste of what it is used to model. So let's start with ideational concurrence. Okay, so where we have a depict choice. So here depiction is concerned with how emoji concur with the cotext to express multimodal items and activities within a field of experience. So we're looking at congruent relations. So for instance, in a text like this, we have a relationship between the dog with the dog emoji, a cup of coffee with the hot beverage emoji. Here is essentially an illustration of thing entities via the emoji. So very congruent in that sense. And the modeling principles involve proximity, they're next to each other, and then minimum mapping, so a classification, exemplification, depending if you look from emoji, from language to emoji or emoji to language. By way of contrast, the alternative choice in this system would be to embellish. So this is activating figurative meanings that are incongruent with the cotext. Okay, so by things like metonymy, emblems, etc. So if we consider a post like this, so for instance, Booko files together with the books emoji, or breakfast together with the cooking and bacon emoji. I put the CLDR names underneath since you can't talk in picture characters. Some of you probably are used to hearing these when you ask Siri to read out a text message or something. You'll get those names. So here, this is a metonymic use, so that objects are standing for concepts. So a book and a person are different, and the book is a metonym here. So, but metonymic relations and other kinds of stuff like this are always a little bit tricky. Everything is always tricky with emoji, probably is the takeaway message. They can be ambiguous in emoji usage, since it's difficult to disambiguate with actual identification. So maybe that's a kind of climb between depiction and embellishment in some sense, even though we're choosing to model it as a distinct choice here. So perhaps your breakfast is actually, eggs and bacon. When is something depiction? When is something embellishment? Really depends on understanding the text that you're working with. Another example here, it's far too entertaining knowing things I probably shouldn't, and just sitting back and letting the universe do its thing, with the hot beverage emoji at the end here. Like what's going on here? We're not representing, there's no lexis in here about coffee or tea or hot chocolate or anything like that. Here, this seems to be an emblematic usage. So the emoji is functioning as an emblem, sorry. So maybe during, or maybe it's emblematic for the the common idea of gossip or spilling the tea, or perhaps it's to do with this meaning of, from the Kermit meme, sitting back and watching something bad unfold, it's none of my business. Okay, so very different to a depiction meaning. So next, looking through an interpersonal lens, we have a choice between imbue and enmesh. Imbue is where essentially interpersonal meaning is targeted at something in the text. So for instance, attitude targeting ideation in the text. So for instance, here, this is from the corpus of people complaining about New South Wales politicians. So New South Wales is a state in Australia. So 21 people have died, and then there's this string of emoji. So this string of emoji is casting attitude back and directing it at this bit of ideation. Okay, so I view this as a kind of coupling relation. The alternative choice is enmesh. Here's where rather than targeting something else, the emoji interweave with the interpersonal meanings in the cotext. So in an example like this, we can see that the emoji tend to go along with positive and negative meanings in the text. So good morning, my dear friend, and these emoji. Oh, that's really a pity, every day can't be the best. Hope Wednesday is much better. So you can see the shifting in the evaluative meaning being echoed in the emoji. And here, prosodic correspondence is the main modelling principle, but obviously we have proximity happening as well. Thirdly, looking through a textual lens, the choice is between inset and punctuate. So inset is where emoji realise roles in the discourse semantics or in the grammar. So for example, thing entities inside figures. Removing the emoji would break the text. It wouldn't be coherent anymore. So the reader has to transduce emoji into language to figure out how it slots into the text. So for example, an example like this, take some and some in return. How would you read that? You know, it depends. Are you a coffee or tea drinker? Perhaps that influence, that kind of semantic priming idea. Take some coffee and a croissant in return. So that's the inset option. The alternative is punctuate. So where the emoji in some sense sit outside the discourse semantic structure. It's a kind of, often as a kind of effectual punctuation, which resonates with the interpersonal meaning across the scope of each preceding figure. So an example like this, there is the emoji is sitting outside of each of the clauses and is functioning kind of like punctuation. Okay. And again, prosodic correspondence and proximity are relevant dimensions. Okay. So that was emoji text relations, and now I'm going to show you how we use that to look at the play of bonds in dialogic affiliation, interactive affiliation. And I think I have three main examples. So the first one is where we're reacting to a bond that's tabled in language sorry. I'm going to show you my network. There's another one. I'm sorry about this. If you don't like system networks, I apologize. But okay, so we're reacting to a bond that's tabled in language during an interaction. That bond, just say it's a good food bond. So we've got, remember I mentioned the idea of coupling earlier. We've got a coupling between a thing entity, so food, and some evaluation, so good, so positive appreciation. These two the things that have come together in the text and are tabling a particular, what I could refer to as a bond. So in terms of dialogic affiliation, what are our options? Well, we can either manage this in the interactions by responding, or we can just ignore it and not respond at all and not engage. That's actually a choice. So if we're going to manage it, we could support or reject the bond. Okay, so if we're going to support it, we can warrant it and deal with it in this moment, or we can kind of defer and laugh it off. If we're going to deal with it, then the options are basically rallying around that exact bond, or perhaps adjusting the appraisal slightly and rallying around something that's within the domain of that bond. Okay, maybe changing the attitude from appreciation to affect, for instance. If we're going to reject it, the options are between dismissing and opposing. So if opposing, dismissing is where we don't table another contrasting bond. Opposing is where we do. So we can either censure or ridicule the initial bond. I find this is most easily explained with Bitmoji. I really need to update my Bitmoji. As you can see, I don't have the same hairstyle, but basically a yeah meaning up there. Let's laugh that off. We don't really share that. That's too controversial to share, so let's rally around something else. Talk to the hand, dismissive meaning, kind of angry censure, or ridicule, parody, sarcasm, this kind of thing. Okay. So that's the kind of, that's a very warp speed kind of survey of the kinds of affiliation strategies that I'm seeing are in play in interactions. So let's look at how we can use this to interpret what's happening in these comment feeds of these TikTok hotel quarantine food review texts that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so there's the frequency of the most frequent emoji in the corpus. So generally, although you can't read the meanings off the emoji in this when they're decontextualized, you can get a sense that it seems to be relatively positive. But what's happening in this corpus? Well, the meanings at stake are probably not that high stakes, aside from some of the social commentary about quarantine. So we've got things like, is it okay to use hot water on Weet-Bix? So Weet-Bix is a kind of cereal. Is Snickers a legitimately popular chocolate bar? Is hotel quarantine jail? And can I eat a lot and still be a worthwhile human? So these are the kinds of things that people are negotiating through the use of their language and through the use of emoji. So the most frequent emoji found in this data set tended to resonate with positive attitudinal meanings by enmeshing with the linguistic attitude found in the cotext. That seemed to be the most common pattern. But they also could be used to index an interactant's emotional state by imbuing or targeting the authorial persona with affect. Okay, so this is this kind of able to do these two things. It allows emoji to simultaneously work to construe evaluation, target at ideational content, as well as being involved in realizing interpersonal contact and solidarity in terms of what's happening in affiliation. So let's look firstly at rallying around a good food bond. So we have a coupling of food and good, so a thing entity and positive appreciation. And the affiliation strategy is that rallying around this meaning. Okay. So here's an example of this happening in an interaction. So user one says, salmon, broccolini, potatoes, that's good food. And the creator, so that's the person who made the TikTok video, says, I know, with several smiling face with heart emoji. User one says, nice AF. And the creator says, it was so good, with a smiling face with hearts emoji. All right, so what's happening here? Well, we're tabling fairly obviously a good food bond. So it's literally instantiated as good food. Okay. But in the response, the creator uses emoji, the emoji in the creator's response resonates with the invoked positivity that in I know. So that we're harmonizing with the general positivity of the meaning, even though there isn't an explicit realization of any appraisal in the text. And we're rallying around the good food bond that was tabled in the initial move. Okay. The next move in this exchange is an example of adjust. So instead of using good as an appraisal, we use nice as AF, right? And so that's an adjusting move. And in the final move, we see again a relation of harmonizing with positive appraisal in the cotext, so good, with the smiling face with hearts. Here again, we're rallying around a good food bond. Okay, so this exchange essentially is an instance of rallying. So those ones are relatively easy to analyze. We also had more complicated cases, and TikTok comments tend to have a lot of humor and different kinds of humor. I was particularly interested in instances that seemed similar to those identified in previous work, looking at casual conversation among young female university students, looking at conversational humor, Naomi Knight's work, where she found a particular kind of bond that get laughed off amongst these kinds of interactants. So she describes it as a happy fatness bond, instantiated as the coupling ideation, eating / attitude plus, positive appreciation. This wrinkles with a shared implicated beautiful thinness bond commensurate with other body conscious values that these interactions share. And the tension generated by this wrinkle is discharged through laughter. Okay, so we can't directly share this happy fatness bond, so we've got to laugh it off. So I'm sure most of you would have been involved in conversations where you talk about, oh gosh, I ate so much chocolate, or I ate so much of this food that I shouldn't have eaten, ha ha ha. What are we laughing off when we laugh in these contexts? So in the corpus, we saw examples of laughing off gendered bonds about appearance, so kind of laughing off this happy fatness. Okay, so we're in the defer pathway in the network. So this included exchanges between interactants where they negotiated gendered meanings about essentially gluttony and body weight via emoji, functioning here as laughter tokens used to laugh off weight-related bonds. So an example like this: came back to see how much you had to put away for dinner, the portions, with 2 hush face emoji. It was a lot, but I was very happy to try this. I love fish. It looks so delicious. See, this is why I'm fat. And we can say the face with tears of joy, a very frequent, in fact, across most quantitative studies, seems to be the most frequently used emoji. Hey, as long as you're happy. Okay, so what is going on in this interaction? So we can see here an imbuing relation. So the hushed face, the meaning here is being targeted at the portions. Oh my gosh, you ate too much, the portions. Okay, tabling and, kind of, for want of a better term, big bad portions bond, right? And the creator replies, yeah, it was a lot, and is essentially rallying around that bond. But then I was very happy to try this. So tabling a happy self and a good food bond. At the end here, the drooling face emoji resonating or harmonizing with the positive appraisal of fish, tabling another kind of good food bond. In the next move, the smiling face with hearts, again resonating, harmonizing with the positive appreciation, and another rallying around that, the other good food bond. But there's a kind of problem here. Like, if we bonded too much over food, can we do this? Should we do this? And so then the creator says, see, this is why I'm fat, with the laugh. Okay, so the face with tears of joy is targeting what comes before it. So it's an imbue relation, and seems to be deferring this kind of fat self. We can't share this. We've got to laugh at it or laugh it off. Hey, as long as you're happy, again, harmonizing with the positive appraisal, the initial emoji, but the second emoji is targeting it. Okay, targeting what comes before. So tabling a happy self, deferring a fat self. So essentially something along the lines, it's okay to be, the subtext here is it's okay to be fat as long as you're happy. Lining with an implicit beautiful thinness bond that we can share. We have to laugh off this fat self bond. Quite interesting. And finally, the last example that I look at, it's one of my favorite examples. And it's an instance in the network. We're in the pathway of opposing and specifically ridicule. So we're going to look at bad quarantine. This is where things get more heated in the TikTok exchanges, where people start to worry about other people's political orientations, and there's some discourse about bad bosses and discourse about America and differing perspectives on quarantine. Okay, so here we're enacting ridicule. So while rallying affiliation was the most common pattern, the corpus contains some instances of disagreement, of disaffiliation, of antagonism. So generally this is around this issue of whether mandatory quarantine unacceptably violates personal freedom. So we got a post like this: it's jail, but it's nice, with the sparkles emoji. And the TikToker says, nothing like jail, but your ignorance is nice, with another sparkles emoji. So what's going on in an exchange like this, and what role is the emoji playing? Well, across this exchange, the sparkle emoji interacts with linguistic attitude to intensify negative evaluations and thus generally contributes to disaffiliative strategies. Okay, so initially here we're tabling a bad quarantine bond. And we can see that the sparkles emoji harmonizes with the positive appreciation in nice, and that the but acts as a kind of like positive blocker. It stops there. Okay. So it's jail, but it's nice. The second part here is essentially tabling a good food bond, because what they're talking about is the food that is shown in the video. Okay. Oops. So perhaps unintentional, but the use of the sparkle emoji here, with its allusion to visual luster or reflection, evokes the idiomatic expression, the gilded cage, to refer to the circumstance that, while you're comfortable, you're in this nice hotel quarantine room, it's pleasant, but you're imprisoned. Okay, that kind of meaning. Collectively, these resources highlight user one's overall negative evaluation of quarantine. And this position stands in contrast to the dominant perspective shared by most of the other commenters in the data set, where generally they're positively evaluating the food, the quarantine as a social practice, and also the TikToker themselves. Okay, so in common sense language, we might describe user one's perspective as derisive of superficial praise for food in the context of imprisonment, which they think is a more important issue. So in response, the creator's repetition of the sparkles emoji references and reflects this parodying ridicule back onto user one. Okay, so we're dismissing the bad quarantine bond, and the sparkles emojis as harmonizing again with the appraisal nice. But what's happening in terms of the bonds, we're rejecting the bad quarantine bond and we're ridiculing it. And there's something going on with this parallelism between the two emoji. So just as user one references positive evaluation of the creator's quarantine experience with the sparkles emoji, the creator references user one's insincere parody with their use of the emoji. Thus, when the creator describes user one's ignorance as quote, nice, they are recovering the same, this kind of ironic reversal of attitude that was established by user one in their post. Okay, so moreover, by flipping the direction of the emoji's negative evaluation back onto user one, the creator is also implicitly mocking user one's stylized kind of use of the emoji itself. Okay, so it's very biting in that sense. In more common sense language, we can describe the creator's response as ridiculing not only the notion that quarantine is like jail, but also user one's attempts at cleverness by subverting the attitudinal polarity of a typical, what is usually a positive emoji, but that's highly dependent on the group of people that use it on the subcultural use. What's really intriguing in this exchange is just how much meaning hinges from both the first and the second instance of the sparkle emoji's use. Okay, and we can see we can see here clearly how it can function both along with the code text and also having that really clear role in terms of affiliation. So hopefully by this point I've shown you how you can't just read affiliation off the emoji without considering first in a kind of detailed way the emoji text relations, just in the same way that you can't read the meaning of emoji via their CLDR short name. So, for example, folded hands here. Okay. So in this talk, we've covered two simultaneous views on emoji use. We've considered their use together with their code text through relations of concurrence, resonance, and synchronicity with language. And we've considered their role as talk in negotiating bonds. So thank you very much, and I hope you found this work interesting.
Thank you so much for a very rich and enticing talk. And we do have some time, and we can enter into discussion. There's already one piece of positive appraisal in the comments, but not joined by a questions, just saying this is very interesting, and the commenter will follow up on your work. So I'm happy to open the floor for discussion. We have about like 12 minutes for comments and questions. Yeah, I can take Alex. Here you go.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And apologies for maybe a thanklessly broad question so early in the morning for some of us. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts. I just wonder about the extent to which it might be too ontological to look at emojis as paralanguage. In the sense that, does language then set some kind of default normativity, and we then end up looking at emojis through a prism of kind of dependency or secondariness, and through prioritizing their relationship with co-text, like you've done. Now, if you ask me what else could I be doing, I mean, I'm thinking in terms of your data, I'm thinking of what you showed us. I'm thinking hashtags, pictures, videos, that's one thing. If you ask me epistemologically what else I could be doing, I mean, okay, there's different answers that I'm not going to get into, but there's the practice perspective, there's the interactional sociolinguistic contextualization cues perspective, and of course, there's the move to translanguaging. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's always a fraught issue in any kind of multimodal discourse analysis. What you conceive of as the center, and how you deal with essentially the fact that all of the modes are already always working together. But as an analyst, you kind of need to find some way to manage the kind of tiers of complexity, and where do you start? Obviously, as a linguist, I'm highly biased towards starting with language and sorting out the problems using some of the existing tools that we have for dealing with language. But yeah, I'm very, very conscious of not wanting to put emoji, images, graphicons, etc., at the kind of semiotic margins. I think there was a conference called Semiotic Margins about 10 years ago on this issue. And yeah, that's not my intention. It's just my observation that in looking at in detail at how the emoji are functioning, that they do tend to seem to be highly dependent on the language, in the sense that you often, I mean, with that sparkles emoji example, you kind of have to see what's going on in the interaction to understand how the sparkles emojis functioning. But it is also an example where studies that go beyond just looking at the text are important, because that sparkles emoji, I think amongst millennials, has a very particular meaning, which I'm not entirely sure. Across different groups, the same emoji can have completely different meanings. So it's always important to think about that. So when we did the first part of our study, initially constructing the Sydney emoji corpus, which was only 1,000 messages, but there we had interviews with people, and we're asking them, what are you doing when you're using this emoji? What do you think it means? Trying to ask them questions that would get them to reflect on the three meta functions that I mentioned, that kind of ideation, interpersonal meaning and textual meaning, without using those words, because obviously if you ask someone, so what's the ideational function here? They're just going to go, what? Yeah, so yeah, I totally agree with you, and it's just such a fraught. It's a fraught issue in multimodal research. We do in the book, so I feel like I'm going on a bit. We do have a chapter looking beyond emoji at relations with other graphicons. Specifically, we just looked at how they function together with animated GIFs. We would have liked to have done more, but it's just so complex that you've got to kind of scope it a bit. Yeah, but definitely relations with hashtags, with images, with all kinds of other dimensions of social media discourse are important.
Thank you so much. I shall look forward to the book. Thanks.
Thanks.
I have one hand, and before that, I will take a question in the chat by Alessia Batista, who's asking a methodological question. I was wondering, she says, if you found some software which is able to recognize emoji. Common corpus analysis software does not properly see emoji, so they need to be counted manually.
Yeah. Yeah, no, unfortunately, we've had to use some Python scripts to try and figure out that problem of recognizing which ones are base emoji. Yeah, so it's generally you can't do it yet with concordant software, although I think AntConc, that software might be going to be able to cope with emoji. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, it's just it is an issue but usually you need to do something extra to process the corpus. You can't just, unfortunately, suck it out of social media and pop it into concordant software. Although I do suspect there are some studies that do that and haven't necessarily figured out that they aren't exactly counting what they think they are counting. And potentially it doesn't matter that much, depending on what you're looking at. In terms of how it skews the statistics, it might not matter too much, depending on how much data you have. Yeah.
Okay with this. And there are issues with reproductions in papers and books. So I look forward to see how you solved that in your book. We had recently big issues with having publishers reproducing emoji. Okay, let's take Artie.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for an amazing talk. I'm interested in, you said you led some interviews with users and respondents, and was there ever a divergence between the intended meaning and the received meaning of emojis? I'm very interested in that because as you said, the millennials have some different, my daughter is a millennial, and in our family chat group with my parents, sometimes we have funny explanations, of emojis that are used in the wrong way, in my daughter's opinion. So did you have any of these instances of a divergent meaning?
Yeah, I mean, they were in terms of, say, my reading position as a middle-aged woman looking at these texts, thinking, I can tell. Often you get a sense that, there's something here that means more than it means, and you have to ask to find out, or you have to collect some additional kind of data. I can't think of any exact ones aside from that millennial use of the sparkles emoji. But yeah, interestingly, my children who are teenagers now, they don't really use emoji, and I think they laugh at me for analyzing emoji. Like, why do we need this? So they're about, so it's a 13-year-old and 17-year-old. So that's quite funny. They tend to think that emoji are kind of passé. So it's really interesting. It's super interesting.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I'm happy to put myself on the list, if I may, with the following. So I started asking myself how your model relates to other models about emoji functions. There are some of them around. But to make this more specific, I realized that one of the emoji functions that are sort of repeatedly recognized in other models has to do with how emoji alter or modify the locutionary force of the utterance before them. So again, there's a relation between the verbal context and the emoji, and this can be a relation of, let's say, indicating irony or indicating that what is written is not meant verbally, but as a joke or things like that. And so we find this in Herring's Graphicons model, and we find this with Gretchen McCulloch, I think, in their work on emoji, and also in some models we have in German language scholarship, like by Pappert and Beiswenger, for example. So if I take this idea of emoji modifying the elocutionary force of an utterance, of a comment or whatever, is there a fixed correspondence of that within your network, or would you say that depending on the occurrence, this could be filed under concurrence or under resonance? So that's a question, how to make sense of the correspondences between your model and other models when it comes to analysis. Yes.
Oh, yeah. There's always the kind of worry about exhaustivity in any networking situation. So generally, I would be covering that within interpersonal meaning, so within emoji resonating with language. And we do have an option in the network. We've got resound, where it goes along with, or rebound, where you like rebound back, and the meanings, there's a tension there, and that's where we account for ones that involve things like irony or other voices, like the perspective of another voice in the as well. So, yeah, all of that stuff's really important, and definitely one of the things I kind of had to leave out a bit in the talk just because of time was all of that. There's such a rich productive work happening on emoji across different areas of linguistics, and we definitely have drawn inspiration from a lot of that, and we've hopefully are accounting for most of the ways of looking, but obviously it's a particular model. We're adopting a particular strategy, so we'll tend to prioritize some things that others might be not prioritizing, and vice versa.
Thank you for this.
I think the other thing I wanted to mention was that although I'm using SFL discourse semantics when modeling, like looking at in detail at the language emoji relations, you could use other kinds of grammatical models or something equally there. I think try to be inclusive. So yeah, I think that hopefully the work is general enough that it can be usable across different schools of linguistics. Yeah.
All right, we could take another quick one if there is any. I'm just scanning the field. I don't see anything. It seems it's lunchtime for some of us, dinner time to others, or maybe breakfast time to yet others. So thanks a lot, Michele Zappavigna, for this great talk once again.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to see. I can see some familiar names in the participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and please all join us again. I think on the, when is it? The 20, Marcus?
It's the 8th of June.
The 8th of June for the last talk before the summer break by Scott Kiesling on enregisterment. Okay, hopefully see you soon again. Thanks a lot and have a great day or a great evening.